As we discussed in our previous video lesson, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, protects student education records by guaranteeing access to students and parents to their own education records and preventing unauthorized sharing of education records. There are several exceptions under FERPA, however, in which districts can share student education records without parental consent. We reviewed most of these in the last video lesson. In this video lesson, we will be looking at the exception for school officials with legitimate educational interest. This exception is the most commonly violated because often the internal staff we share information with do not actually have legitimate educational interest. Being a teacher or other educator or staff in the school building is not enough. To have legitimate educational interest, knowing the student information in question needs to be essential for the staff member to do their job. Here's an example of when you would not have legitimate educational interest. Imagine that an ambulance pulls up in front of the school building and a student is loaded onto a stretcher and taken to the hospital in the ambulance. When these events happen in school, they are often simultaneously scary and interesting. Everyone wants to know what is going on. But do you have a legitimate educational interest to know which student was being loaded onto the ambulance? Perhaps if they are one of your students and when they return to school, they need increased medical care, but otherwise, probably not. And even if so, that information will likely not be necessary for you to do your job until the students return. Do you have a legitimate educational interest to know why the student was being loaded onto the ambulance? Again, most likely not. A more common example would be the types of discussions that can happen between teachers, often in the teacher's room. Perhaps a student's behavior has been utterly unmanageable, and you had to write an office referral slip. You may want to vent to your coworkers seeking empathy or sympathy, but unless knowing about the student's behaviors in your class is necessary for the other staff member to fulfill their professional responsibility, sharing that information is a violation of FERPA. Or, staying in the teacher's room, you and an educational technician are creating a support plan for one of your students. You both have legitimate educational interest because this support plan will help you meet the needs of the student. At the same time, however, a teacher from another grade level enters the teacher's room to make copies. That teacher making copies does not have legitimate educational interest, and continuing to have this conversation in their presence is a violation of FERPA. On the other hand, let's assume that you have a student with an individualized education plan, or IEP, which determines special education services, or a 504 plan through the Americans with Disabilities Act. In both cases, you will likely need to provide the student with accommodations to meet the requirements of the plan. In this case, you have legitimate educational interest to meet both your professional and legal obligations. Remember, a legitimate educational interest exists when knowledge of student information is necessary for the person to fulfill their professional responsibilities. Being a school official is not sufficient on its own.